So as you may be aware, we've been talking about the Psalms for the last couple of weeks. This is our third week in a row we're talking about the Psalms. And as you may have picked up on, the Psalms are mostly lyrical in their quality, which makes sense because they're mostly hymns. And as such, as hymns that are lyrical in quality, we tend to think of them in terms of poetry, which is probably true. I mean, the Psalms are full of some of the most beautiful and poignant expressions of human emotion in all of Scripture. But when we think about them just as poetry, we then tend to think of them in terms of all those things that go along with poems. We think about metaphors and similes and alliterations and all kinds of other words that I probably don't know the meaning for. But we try to find hidden meanings in the Psalms. And while that can be true, the Psalms are sometimes also what you see is what you get. Sometimes there is no hidden meaning in these words. Sometimes these words are actually what they say they are. Bear in mind things that have been happening in our state over the past month or so. And think again about the words that David read to us. Save me, O Lord. I am up to my neck in water. The flood is coming to sweep me away. I imagine that more than one person has prayed that prayer in our state over the past month or so. Some of them saved, some of them not. This past month we have been deluged in water, in floodwaters, roaring. Help me because I'm in the mire, the quagmire. We've all seen the pictures on the news. We may even know some people sifting through the debris that is left over when a flood has passed. Those are the words that are being shouted out by the psalmist, and that is the reality of many people's lives nearby us in recent days, and maybe even in the days to come. You know, we modern folk live in a time and a place where we do all that we can to protect ourselves from the elements. We try to protect ourselves from Mother Nature and the catastrophes that unfold. And still, even with all that we've done to protect ourselves, still, every once in a while, as we have seen, we fall victim to the whims of nature. Well, it was even more so the case with the ancients. It was even more so that they were concerned about water, about what water could and would do. You know, like I said, we've been reading about the Psalms for a while now. If you think back to Psalm 1, we find out that water plays an important role in the Psalms. Sometimes it is life-giving, like in Psalm 1, when the psalmist talks about the righteous as being like those who are trees planted by streams of water, giving life, bearing fruit. But sometimes in the Psalms, the water is also a sign of destruction. Save me, O God. I am up to my neck in water. The ancients knew that water could have a devastating effect. And sometimes it's true, though, that we just feel like we're trapped, that we feel like we're drowning. Sometimes we really are. I know that y'all are probably all familiar with gumbo, right? The food. What about gumbo the mud? Does that sound familiar to anybody? I'm not sure if that's a technical term or just what we call it where I was from. But you know, gumbo mud is like a combination of muds. Generally, it's like red clay and sand mixed together, and it is nasty. You can get stuck in that really quick. When I was a kid, there was a pond that we liked to hunt, that we'd go duck hunting at. And one time, I'd heard reports that the birds were really flying, but it had rained a lot. And so the traditional way that we would get to the pond was kind of closed to us. We had to kind of find another way to the pond. And so I drove around to the backside of the pond, and I was going to have to walk across a field that had not been planted. So it was just kind of a bunch of mud at the time. And I started walking across the field, and I've got my gum boots on, my rubber boots, whatever you want to call them. And I'm walking across this field, and I realized it is a field of nothing but gumbo mud. And every step, those boots get heavier and heavier and heavier, until finally I decided it's time to give it up and just go back home. Because I still got a long way to go to get to the pond. But then, I see the birds working. I see ducks coming in. And I'm thinking, well, I can't give up now. So I keep walking, and I keep walking until my boots are so heavy that they're actually not coming up out of the mud anymore. They're just stuck in the mud, and I'm not getting them out. So, as you can imagine, I do what any sensible duck hunter does when they're stuck in the mud and they see ducks in front of them. I kept walking. I just stepped those feet right out of the boots, and I kept walking in my socks. And I kept walking until my socks got stuck in the mud. And I kept walking barefoot until I got to the pond. Thankfully, I'm in Louisiana, remember, so it wasn't all that cold. And of course, by the time I got there, the ducks were gone. And I had a terrible hunt. But I was barefoot hunting, and that was just kind of interesting. The funny thing is that later I told my brother about the experience, and he started laughing, and he said, yeah, I think my boots are out in that field too. The same thing had happened to him. Sometimes we feel as though we are drowning and trapped and stuck in the mire. But sometimes we really are. And so even though the Psalms are mostly lyrical, they can have true, literal meanings as well. This particular psalm, Psalm 69, is known as a lament psalm. You may remember we've been talking about the Psalms in that there are so many of them that we tend to like to put them into categories so that they're easier to digest, like Pringles. Well, this flavor of psalm is one of lament. Psalms of lament are the places where we cry to God. They're not just complaining. It sounds like that, but there's more to it than that. Psalms of lament are where we hold God accountable. Psalms of lament are where we look around and we see that life is not as it should be. And we see that God has promised us it will be better, and so we remind God that there are certain things that God is supposed to do. That's a psalm of lament. A psalm of lament is when we recognize that life is not good, and God, you said it was going to be better than this. Psalms of lament are where we call God to task, where we challenge God, where we remind God that God is supposed to keep God's promises. This is something that children are really good at. Don't ever make a promise to a child that you're not going to keep. Because you might forget that you made that promise. They will not forget that you made that promise. And you will be reminded of that promise. Even if in your mind you never made that promise, you will be reminded of that promise that you did not keep. When I was a child, my whole family wanted a ski boat. And when I say my whole family wanted a ski boat, I mean everyone except my dad wanted a ski boat. And this caused a little bit of turmoil, a little tension. And so my mom, as brilliant as she is, came up with a good solution, a good compromise. She said to all three of us children, why don't y'all start saving your money? And if you can save up to $300 a piece, then maybe we'll be able to get a ski boat. And so we were all excited about this. And so my mom got a sheet of paper. She wrote our names on it, and she wrote dates on it. And she put it on the fridge, and whenever we would save money, we would bring it to her, and she would keep track of it. She kept a little tally sheet. And it took us a long time to come up with that much money. And I remember watching it, excitedly watching it, thinking we're getting closer and closer to that ski boat. And then we got around the 250 mark, the 260 mark, and somewhere in that area, that sheet of paper just disappeared. So I guess we never really got to 300, and we never got a boat, and nothing was ever said about it again. It's 30 years later, and I was complaining to my dad about that this week. Psalms of Lament are those places where we remind God about the promises that God made. They sound like it's just a bunch of complaining, but it's not. It's recognizing life is not as it should be, and God promised it was going to be better than this. Some people refer to Psalms of Lament as Psalms of disorientation. Walter Brueggemann, in his book, Praying the Psalms, says that our lives, our journeys of faith with God, go through phases. And they go through phases of secure orientation to haphazard disorientation, and then suddenly to a pleasing reorientation of our lives. And he says the Psalms also follow this pattern. When he talks about secure orientation is when we are in a situation of stable equilibrium. Everything's good. God is in his heaven and all is right with the world. That is the place of stable equilibrium. That is the place of secure orientation. That is the place for which we all yearn. But unfortunately, it's not very interesting. It's not very exciting. And when we're in that place of stable equilibrium, when God is in his heaven and all is right with the world, it's just that. Everything's just okay. And oddly enough, in those tranquil moments of peacefulness, we hardly ever take notice of God. But events and situations of disorientation are very different. When that equilibrium is disrupted, when things are not right with the world, then we really notice God. As Brueggemann says, in those moments of disorientation, we are taken to the edge of our humanness, and there we are peculiarly aware of the presence of the Holy One. When we are in disoriented places in our lives, we are vulnerable and open to the presence of God, more so than any other time in our lives. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying about wartime, but there's a saying that says there are no atheists in a foxhole. In times of disorientation, we are particularly aware of God and what God ought to be doing in our lives. And then Reverend talks about in Psalms of disorientation, we then move to a new place, a surprising new place of reorientation. It's not the equilibrium that we once had. It's not the life we once had. It's the new life that we find, that we look forward to get out of that place of disorientation. That new relationship we have with God, with whom we have been vulnerable. That new relationship with the Holy One, of whom we are peculiarly aware. That is reorientation, relocation. If you ever spend any time in the woods, chances are you will eventually get lost in the woods. And if you get lost in the woods, you learn either what you are supposed to do or what you are not supposed to do really quickly. And if you are in the woods and you are lost in the woods and you realize there's no chance of someone finding you if you stay put, you realize, I've got to get out of the woods. And so you have to reorient where you are going. If you have a general idea about where you should go, you don't just walk off in that way. You look out ahead, way ahead of where you can, almost as far as you can see, to find a new point, a new bearing, a new place of location. And you orient towards that new bearing. It might be a tree, it might be a rock, there's no telling, but you aim far off and you reorient to where you are going to go. The psalmist realizes that in the midst of their disorientation, they have to find a new bearing. The psalmist in 69 is completely lost. They are both figuratively and literally lost, and they need a new bearing, a new orientation, and that new orientation is God. The hope of reorientation, the hope of finding that new bearing, that new life with God. Their old life is gone. It'll never be the same. It's been swept away in the floodwaters. It is brought down in the mire and the debris. But the hope of a new life, of reorientation with God, that's what the psalmist is looking for. These are also psalms of disorientation, but with disorientation comes surprising reorientation. So where is the good in all of this? I mean, is it just that we should complain more often? That we should gripe? That we should be upset and let everybody know that we're upset? No. Because complaining is just complaining. Lament psalms recognize that life isn't always okay. And it's okay to give voice to that. And sometimes we're afraid to do that. How many times have you had a terrible, terrible day and have someone come up to you and say, "Oh, hi, how are you doing?" And you just say, "Fine." How many times have you approached someone who you know had a terrible day, ask how they're doing, and hope that they say fine? A good friend of mine from college, brother passed away, and I talked to him after that, and he said that one thing that baffled him in the whole experience was how many people would come up to him at the funeral and say, "How are you doing? You doing okay?" And he knew they expected him to just say, "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm fine." Even though what he really wanted to say was, "How do you think I'm doing? My brother died. I'm sad. I'm upset. I'm confused." He actually used a little more colorful language than that. Lament psalms recognize that it's okay to say that we're not fine. And when we give honest feedback about how we are feeling to God, we come to a new understanding of God. When we call God accountable, we come to a new way of seeing how God is and is not working in our lives. Psalms of lament reorient us into a new way of being with God. And maybe I'm naive to think so, but I feel like there is good in that. Amen.